England, 1839. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of Langley House with a timidity that seemed to mirror Beatrice's own existence. She sat at her writing desk, her slender fingers tracing the worn edges of a leather-bound volume on ancient Greek philosophy, her eyes absorbing words that transported her far beyond the confines of her gilded cage. At 23, Beatrice Langley possessed a beauty that would have captured the attention of every eligible gentleman in London, had she been permitted to venture into their midst. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight like burnished copper, and her green eyes held an intelligence that burned with an intensity rarely found in young ladies of her station. Yet Beatrice knew that her beauty and intellect were wasted treasures, locked away like precious jewels in a vault to which only her stepmother held the key. Lady Cordelia Langley had entered her life 15 years prior, sweeping into Langley House on the arm of Beatrice's grieving father like a raven descending upon a wounded dove. At the tender age of 8, Beatrice had still been mourning her beloved mother when Cordelia had begun her campaign of gentle tyranny, so subtle and insidious that Lord Edmund Langley remained blind to it even now. Beatrice. The sharp voice cut through her reverie like a blade through silk. You have been at those books since dawn. Such excessive study is most unbecoming in a young lady. It will strain your eyes and coarsen your countenance. Beatrice looked up to find her stepmother framed in the doorway, her angular features arranged in an expression of disapproval that had become as familiar as her own reflection. Lady Cordelia was handsome in a severe way, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin across her prominent cheekbones. She wore black despite being widowed nearly a decade ago from her first husband, as though she were in perpetual mourning for joy itself. I was merely reading, stepmother, Beatrice replied softly, closing the book with careful reverence. Surely there is no harm in that. No harm? Cordelia swept into the room with the rustle of taffeta and the faint scent of lavender water. Reading fills your head with fanciful notions and unsuitable ideas. It makes you peculiar, Beatrice. No gentleman wishes for a wife who can discourse on philosophy when she should be concentrating on the management of a household and the comfort of her husband. Beatrice bit back the retort that rose to her lips. She had learned long ago that arguing with Cordelia was as futile as arguing with the wind. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and waited for whatever new restriction her stepmother had devised. Your father and I have been discussing your future, Cordelia continued, moving to examine the books on Beatrice's shelf with barely concealed distaste. We agree that you have become far too scholarly in your habits. It is time you devoted yourself to more appropriate pursuits. Therefore, I am restricting your visits to the museum to once per month, rather than weekly. The words struck Beatrice like a physical blow. Her weekly visits to the British Museum were the one freedom she had managed to preserve, the single bright thread in the tapestry of her constrained existence. It was there, among the ancient artifacts and whispered histories, that she felt truly alive. But stepmother, surely the matter is settled. Cordelia's voice brooked no argument. You should be grateful that I permit you any indulgences at all. Many young ladies would consider themselves fortunate to have such careful guidance. Your dear mother, rest her soul, would have wanted me to ensure your proper upbringing. Beatrice's fingers tightened around the edge of her book until her knuckles turned white. Cordelia always invoked her mother's memory when she wished to inflict the deepest cuts, knowing that Beatrice could not protest without seeming to dishonor her mother's wishes. It was a cruelty of the most refined sort, one that left no visible marks, but carved deep wounds nonetheless. As Cordelia departed with a swish of her skirts, Beatrice turned to gaze out the window at the bustling streets of Mayfair. She could see elegant carriages passing by, ladies in their finest day dresses promenading with their companions, gentlemen on horseback tipping their hats to acquaintances. It was a world she glimpsed but never truly inhabited. While other young ladies of her age and station were attending balls, soirees and garden parties during the season, Beatrice remained at home, her attendance at such events perpetually forbidden by Cordelia under the guise of protecting her reputation and ensuring her proper development. Her father, dear man though he was, believed every word his wife uttered. Lord Edmund had been so devastated by his first wife's death that he had gratefully surrendered all household management to Cordelia, believing her stern rules were motivated by maternal concern rather than something darker and more possessive. Beatrice had tried years ago to make him understand, but Cordelia had painted her protests as the rebellious whims of a headstrong girl, and her father had sided with his wife. The days passed with the monotonous rhythm of a clock that never varied. Beatrice rose early, breakfasted alone while her father attended to business, and Cordelia planned her daily campaign of restrictions, spent her mornings at her needlework or practicing the pianoforte under Cordelia's watchful eye, took her solitary luncheon, and then was permitted a brief walk in the garden before an evening of reading approved texts aloud to her stepmother while Cordelia worked at her embroidery and offered corrections to Beatrice's posture, diction, and comportment. It was a life of such carefully cultivated tedium that Beatrice sometimes wondered if she might simply fade away from lack of color and light, like a flower kept too long in shadow. Her only true solace remained her books, which she devoured with a hunger that no amount of restriction could fully quell, and her visits to the museum, which now loomed before her like an oasis in an endless desert. When the appointed day arrived for her monthly visit, Beatrice dressed with particular care, choosing a walking dress of deep green that complemented her eyes and made her feel, for a few precious hours at least, like a woman of the world rather than a prisoner in her own home. Cordelia insisted on sending her maid, Agnes, as a chaperone, but Agnes was a kind soul who understood her mistress's need for small freedoms and had learned to position herself at a discreet distance that allowed Beatrice to breathe. The British Museum rose before her like a temple to everything she valued: knowledge, beauty, history, and truth. Beatrice climbed the steps with a lightness in her heart that she felt nowhere else, passing beneath the great columns and into the cool, echoing halls where the past spoke in whispers and sometimes in shouts. She made her way directly to the Gallery of Classical Antiquities, her favorite haunt, where Greek and Roman sculptures stood in silent testimony to civilizations long vanished. Here she could lose herself in contemplation of ancient wisdom, in the delicate curves of a marble goddess, or the stern countenance of a philosopher captured in stone. It was among these silent companions that Beatrice felt most herself, most free. She was examining a particularly fine statue of Athena, goddess of wisdom, when she became aware of someone watching her. The sensation was distinct, like the touch of sunlight on skin, and when she turned, she found herself looking directly into the most remarkable pair of eyes she had ever encountered. They belonged to a gentleman of perhaps 30 years, tall and commanding in stature, with dark hair that held just a hint of wave and features that might have been carved by the same master who had created the statues surrounding them. He wore his clothes with the easy elegance of one born to privilege, his tailcoat perfectly fitted across broad shoulders, his cravat tied with understated sophistication. But it was his eyes that held her captive, dark and intense, regarding her with an expression of such focused interest that she felt suddenly breathless. "Forgive my intrusion," he said, his voice rich and cultured, "but I could not help but notice your contemplation of Athena. She is a particular favorite of mine as well." Beatrice knew she should turn away, make some polite excuse, and retreat to Agnes's side. Young ladies did not engage in conversation with strange gentlemen, no matter how distinguished their appearance. Yet something in his gaze held her, some quality of genuine interest that she had so rarely encountered, that she found herself responding before prudence could intervene. "She represents so much that I admire," Beatrice replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Wisdom, courage, independence. She was born fully formed from Zeus's head, needing no one's permission to exist or to exercise her considerable powers." The gentleman's eyes widened slightly, and she saw something kindle there that might have been surprise, or perhaps delight. "An interesting perspective, and one that suggests you have made a study of Greek mythology beyond the superficial." "I have had considerable time for study," Beatrice said, and then worried that she had revealed too much. But there was something about this stranger that invited confidence, that made her want to speak truths she had long kept hidden. "I am Damien Wycliffe," he said, executing a bow that was both proper and oddly intimate. "Duke of Ashworth, though I confess I prefer to be simply Damien when among the ancients. They care nothing for titles, only for the truth of one's character. Beatrice felt her heart begin to race. She had heard of the Duke of Ashworth, of course. Who had not? He was one of the most sought-after bachelors in England, wealthy beyond measure, handsome, and possessed of a reputation for intelligence and integrity that set him apart from the usual run of aristocratic gentlemen. Every ambitious mother in London had set her cap at him for her daughters, yet he remained obstinately unmarried, attending balls and social events with polite disinterest, dancing dutifully, but never showing particular favour to any lady. "I am Beatrice Langley," she heard herself say, offering a curtsy that felt absurdly formal given the strange intimacy of their conversation. "Miss Langley." He spoke her name as though testing its weight, finding it pleasing. "Tell me, what brings a lady of evident learning to the museum today? Surely you must have countless social engagements demanding your attention during the season." The question, innocent though it was, opened a door Beatrice had not meant to approach. Yet she found herself stepping through it, drawn by the genuine curiosity in his expression and the peculiar certainty that this man, this duke she had met mere moments ago, would understand what others could not. "I have no social engagements," she said quietly. "I am not permitted to attend balls or parties. My stepmother believes such activities would be detrimental to my character and reputation. Thus, I have made the museum my ballroom and the poets and philosophers my dancing partners." She had meant to speak lightly, to make a jest of her circumstances, but her voice betrayed her, carrying an undercurrent of loneliness that she immediately wished she could retract. Damien's expression shifted, the polite interest deepening into something more profound. "Not permitted," he repeated carefully. "Forgive me if I presume, but you appear to be of an age where such decisions might reasonably be your own." Beatrice offered a sad smile. Age matters little when one's stepmother holds the keys to every door, and one's father believes his wife acts only from the purest motives. "Lady Cordelia has decreed that I am not ready for society, and so I remain at home, studying and reading and becoming, as she frequently reminds me, increasingly peculiar and unsuitable for marriage. It is an interesting paradox. I am kept from society to preserve my suitability for it, yet with each passing year, that very isolation makes me less suitable in the eyes of the world." Damien moved closer, his attention so completely focused upon her that Beatrice felt as though they were the only two people in the vast museum. "May I be frank with you, Miss Langley?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I have attended every ball, soirée and social gathering this season has offered," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I have danced with dozens of young ladies, each carefully groomed to display their accomplishments like performing ponies at a fair. They recite their pieces, play their approved selections on the pianoforte, display their watercolors and their needlework, and speak only of the weather, fashion, and the most innocuous gossip. Not one of them has looked at a statue of Athena and seen in her a reflection of their own desires for wisdom and independence. Not one has spoken with such intelligence and passion about anything of substance. Your stepmother has sought to make you unsuitable for marriage, Miss Langley, but what she has actually done is make you unsuitable for the sort of tedious match that plagues most of society. She has, quite inadvertently, made you extraordinary." The words fell upon Beatrice like rain upon parched earth. She stared at Damien, searching his face for mockery or deception, but found only sincerity and something else, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch in her throat. "You speak very boldly, Your Grace," she managed to say. "I have learned that life is too short for timidity," he replied. "I lost my parents when I was young, not unlike yourself, I suspect. I inherited the dukedom at 20, and with it the responsibility for vast estates and hundreds of people dependent upon my decisions. Such responsibility teaches one to recognize value when one encounters it, and to seize opportunity rather than let it slip away." They stood in silence for a moment, the ancient statues bearing witness to the beginning of something neither could yet name. Then Damien spoke again, his voice carrying an intensity that made Beatrice tremble. "There is to be a ball next week at Ashworth House. It is the culminating event of the season, and every eligible lady in London will be in attendance. Miss Langley, would you do me the extraordinary honour of attending as my particular guest?" The invitation hung between them, beautiful and impossible as a star plucked from the sky. Beatrice felt tears prick at her eyes, mourning what could never be, even as her heart soared at the asking. "Your Grace, I cannot," she whispered. "I have already told you that I am not permitted to attend balls. My stepmother would never allow it." "Then we shall not ask her permission," Damien said, his jaw setting with determination. "I shall call upon your father and extend the invitation formally. Surely even the most severe stepmother cannot deny a duke." Beatrice shook her head, though every fibre of her being longed to say yes. "You do not understand. She will find a way. She always does. She will claim I am ill, or that there has been a family emergency, or that some scandal makes it impossible. I have learned not to hope for such things, Your Grace. Hope is the cruelest master when it cannot be fulfilled." Damien reached out, and for one breathless moment, Beatrice thought he might take her hand. Propriety held him back, but his fingers trembled with the restraint. "Miss Langley, I have built my life on making the impossible possible. I have turned failing estates into profitable enterprises, negotiated peace between warring families, and convinced Parliament to pass legislation that wiser men claimed could never succeed. Do you truly believe that one obstinate stepmother will prove an insurmountable obstacle?" Despite herself, despite years of disappointment and crushed hopes, Beatrice felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as possibility. "I would very much like to attend your ball, Your Grace," she said softly, "but I fear you will find my stepmother a more formidable opponent than failing estates or recalcitrant parliamentarians." "Then let us make it a wager," Damien replied, and now he did smile, an expression of such warmth and confidence that Beatrice felt her own lips curve in response. "If I succeed in securing your attendance at my ball, you must promise me the first dance and the supper dance. If I fail, I shall—" "What would you have me do?" "Return here next month and tell me about all the ladies who attended," Beatrice said, trying to match his light tone, though her heart felt too full for jesting. "Describe their gowns and their conversation, so that I might imagine what I have missed." "A poor forfeit," Damien said, "for I would far rather have you there to see it all yourself. But very well, Miss Langley. The wager is struck." Agnes appeared then, her discreet distance finally overcome by the lengthy duration of Beatrice's conversation with this unknown gentleman. "Miss Beatrice, we should be returning home. Lady Cordelia will be expecting you for luncheon." The spell broke, and Beatrice felt reality crash back upon her like a wave. She curtsied to Damien, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their entire conversation and the impossibility of the dreams he had awakened. "Good day, Your Grace," she said formally. "Thank you for the pleasant discussion of antiquities." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Langley," he replied, bowing deeply. "I shall call upon your father tomorrow to discuss arrangements for the ball. I look forward to seeing you there." As Agnes hurried her from the museum, Beatrice glanced back once to find Damien still watching her, his expression thoughtful and determined. She wanted to call out to him, to warn him more forcefully about Cordelia's iron will and her father's blind devotion to his wife. But the words died on her lips, and she allowed herself to be led away, carrying with her the memory of dark eyes and impossible promises. That evening, Beatrice sat at dinner with her father and Cordelia, pushing food around her plate while her stepmother discoursed on the unsuitability of the new fashion for higher waistlines, and her father nodded along with benign disinterest. Lord Edmund was a kind man, his once handsome face now lined with the cares of business and the comfortable complacency of a man who believed his household ran smoothly without his intervention. He loved his daughter, Beatrice knew, but he loved her in the distant, abstract way of a man who had surrendered the daily business of family life to feminine management. "You seem distracted this evening, Beatrice," Cordelia observed, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I trust your visit to the museum did not overtax your constitution. Perhaps we should reduce your outings further if they leave you in such a state." "No, stepmother," Beatrice said quickly. "I am merely tired." The museum was most edifying, as always. "Edifying," Cordelia repeated, making the word sound like an accusation. "A young lady's mind need not be so thoroughly edified. It unsettles the humours and creates dissatisfaction with one's proper station in life." Lord Edmund cleared his throat, his customary signal that he wished to change the subject. "My dear, I received word today that the Duke of Ashworth may call tomorrow on a matter of some importance. We must ensure the house is in order to receive him." Beatrice's fork clattered against her plate, drawing Cordelia's immediate attention. She forced herself to breathe steadily, to show no reaction that might betray the wild hope and terror battling in her chest. "The Duke of Ashworth?" Cordelia's voice sharpened with interest. "What business could he possibly have with us?" "I confess I do not know," Lord Edmund replied. "His secretary sent word requesting an audience at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Most peculiar, but one does not refuse a duke, particularly one so highly regarded as Ashworth." Beatrice kept her eyes fixed upon her plate, afraid that her face would reveal everything. He had meant it then. Damien had actually intended to follow through on his impossible promise. She felt a mixture of elation and dread so intense that she thought she might be ill. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, replaying every moment of her encounter with Damien. The way he had looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just her face, but the person beneath. The way he had spoken to her as an equal, engaging with her thoughts and ideas rather than dismissing them as unsuitable for a lady. The way his voice had deepened when he spoke of recognizing value and seizing opportunity. No one had ever looked at Beatrice that way before. No one had ever suggested that her intelligence and education were assets rather than flaws to be concealed or corrected. And now this remarkable man, this duke who could have any woman in England, had chosen to champion her cause against Cordelia's tyranny. But what if Cordelia prevailed as she always did? What if she found some way to deny the invitation, to keep Beatrice locked away while the world danced without her? Worse still, what if Damien's interest was merely that of a kind man performing a charitable act, and Beatrice had foolishly allowed herself to believe it meant something more? She rose before dawn, too anxious to remain in bed, and dressed with particular care. She chose her finest day dress, a creation of pale blue muslin that her mother had ordered, made shortly before her death, one of the few possessions Cordelia had not found reason to alter or discard. Beatrice braided her hair with trembling fingers, trying to tame the auburn waves into something elegant and sophisticated. The morning crept by with agonizing slowness. Cordelia seemed to sense something amiss, circling Beatrice like a hawk that has spotted prey, but not yet determined the best angle of attack. At breakfast, she commented on Beatrice's dress. "That gown is quite old-fashioned, my dear. Whatever possessed you to wear it today?" "I felt it appropriate," Beatrice replied carefully. "It reminds me of Mother." Cordelia's lips thinned at the mention of the First Lady Langley, but she said nothing more. She could hardly object to Beatrice honouring her late mother's memory, though Beatrice knew the reference irritated her. As 2 o'clock approached, Beatrice positioned herself in the drawing-room with a book, trying to appear absorbed, while her every sense strained toward the sound of the door. Lord Edmund paced near the window, his nervous energy betraying his own anxiety about receiving such an august visitor. Cordelia sat rigidly in her favourite chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of calculated curiosity. The clock struck the hour, and moments later they heard the butler's measured tread in the hall. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth," he announced, and then Damien entered the room and Beatrice felt her breath catch all over again. He was dressed impeccably, his dark coat fitting him like a glove, his cravat tied in an intricate style that suggested both elegance and authority. But it was the look in his eyes as they swept the room and found her that made Beatrice's heart race. In that glance she saw recognition, determination, and something that looked remarkably like joy. Lord Edmund rushed forward, bowing deeply. "Your Grace, you honour our home with your presence. I confess I am most curious about the nature of your visit." "Lord Langley," Damien replied, his voice carrying the natural authority of one born to command. "I thank you for receiving me on such short notice. The matter I wish to discuss is of some delicacy, and I hope you will permit me to speak freely." "Of course, Your Grace." "Please, be seated. May I present my wife, Lady Cordelia Langley, and my daughter, Miss Beatrice Langley." Damien bowed to Cordelia with perfect correctness, then turned to Beatrice. When he took her hand and kissed it in greeting, she felt the touch like a brand, warm and claiming. "Miss Langley and I met yesterday at the British Museum. It was a most enlightening encounter." Cordelia's eyes narrowed, and Beatrice saw the wheels of her stepmother's mind begin to turn, calculating implications and formulating responses. "How delightful," Cordelia said, her voice honey-sweet with an undercurrent of warning. Beatrice so rarely has the opportunity to converse with gentlemen, given her retiring nature and delicate constitution. "I hope she did not bore you with her excessive interest in dusty old artifacts." "On the contrary," Damien replied smoothly, taking his seat with the easy grace of one completely at home in any setting. "I found Miss Langley's knowledge and perspective quite refreshing. It is rare to encounter a lady who can discourse so intelligently on classical philosophy and mythology, which brings me to the purpose of my visit." Lord Edmund leaned forward eagerly. "Please, Your Grace, speak freely." "I'm hosting a ball next week at Ashworth House," Damien began. "It is to be the premier event of the season, with guests including members of the royal family and distinguished visitors from the continent. After meeting Miss Langley yesterday, I found myself quite struck by her intelligence and grace. I would be honored if she would attend as my particular guest." The silence that followed this pronouncement was so profound that Beatrice could hear the ticking of the mantel clock. Lord Edmund's face transformed, his expression moving from surprise to delight to paternal pride in rapid succession. "Your Grace, this is an extraordinary honor," he exclaimed. "Of course Beatrice must attend, to be singled out by the Duke of Ashworth himself. My dear, you have made your old father very proud. Lady Cordelia, is this not wonderful news?" All eyes turned to Cordelia, who sat frozen in her chair, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Beatrice knew that expression well. It was the look her stepmother wore when her carefully constructed plans were being threatened, when she felt her control slipping away. But even Cordelia could not openly refuse a duke's invitation, not without revealing the true nature of her restrictions on Beatrice. "It is indeed unexpected, Your Grace," Cordelia said, her voice tight. "However, I fear there may be some impediment to Beatrice's attendance. She has been experiencing a delicate constitution of late, and I worry that the excitement and exertion of a grand ball might prove too taxing for her health." Damien's expression remained pleasant, but Beatrice saw steel enter his eyes. "I am sorry to hear that Miss Langley has been unwell. However, she appeared in excellent health yesterday at the museum. Perhaps the indisposition is not as severe as you feared." "A mother knows her child's constitution better than a stranger, no matter how exalted his title," Cordelia replied, and Beatrice heard the warning in her voice. But Cordelia had made a critical error in claiming maternal authority over a stepdaughter, while speaking to a man who clearly valued honesty. "Indeed," Damien said quietly, "a mother's concern is natural and proper. However, I must confess that Miss Langley mentioned certain restrictions placed upon her social activities. It would be a grave pity if an unfounded concern for her health were to deprive her of an opportunity that might never come again. Lord Langley, as Miss Langley's father, surely the decision rests with you." It was a masterful stroke. Damien had simultaneously reminded Lord Edmund of his paternal authority, while gently implying that Cordelia's restrictions might not be entirely motivated by genuine concern for Beatrice's well-being. Beatrice watched her father's face, saw confusion war with pride, saw him look between his wife and daughter as though truly seeing them for the first time in years. "Beatrice, my dear, are you truly unwell?" Lord Edmund asked, his voice uncertain. "You look quite healthy to me." "I am very well, father," Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I would be honored to attend His Grace's ball if you permit it." "But Edmund," Cordelia interjected, rising from her chair, "you must consider the implications. Beatrice has not been in society. She lacks the proper gowns, the necessary preparation. She will be completely overwhelmed by such a grand event. It would be kinder to decline the invitation than to set her up for certain humiliation." "I have considered these concerns," Damien said, his voice carrying an edge that made it clear he would not be deterred. "I would be pleased to place my own dressmaker and other necessary resources at Miss Langley's disposal." My late mother's modiste is the finest in London, and she would be honoured to create appropriate attire for Miss Langley. As for the social aspects, I shall personally ensure that Miss Langley is comfortable throughout the evening. She will be under my protection and guidance." The offer was so generous, so clearly motivated by genuine interest rather than mere politeness, that even Cordelia could not refuse it without appearing churlish and cruel. Lord Edmund's face had lit up with an expression of paternal pride and social ambition that made Beatrice's chest tighten with a mixture of hope and resentment. Why had her father never questioned Cordelia's restrictions before? Why had it taken a duke's intervention to make him truly look at his daughter? "This is most generous, Your Grace," Lord Edmund said warmly. "Of course Beatrice shall attend. It is an opportunity beyond anything I had dreamed for her. Lady Cordelia, you must see that this is a blessing. Think of what it could mean for Beatrice's future." Cordelia's jaw clenched so tightly that Beatrice could see the muscle jump beneath her skin. But she had been outmaneuvered, and she knew it. To continue objecting would reveal the true nature of her control over Beatrice, and potentially damage her own standing in her husband's eyes. "Of course you are quite right, Edmund," she said, though each word seemed to cost her dearly. "I am merely concerned for Beatrice's welfare, as any mother would be. But if His Grace is willing to provide such extensive assistance, then naturally we must accept this gracious invitation." "Excellent," Damien said, rising from his seat. "I shall send Madame Rousseau to call upon Miss Langley tomorrow morning to begin preparations for her attire. And, Miss Langley, I look forward to claiming those dances you have promised me." He smiled at Beatrice, and in that smile she saw triumph and promise and something that made her breath catch in her throat. He had done it. He had actually done it. The impossible had been made possible, and in 1 week's time she would walk into a ballroom on the arm of the Duke of Ashworth himself. After Damien departed, the house erupted into activity. Lord Edmund was beside himself with excitement, already penning notes to his friends about his daughter's extraordinary invitation. Cordelia retreated to her rooms with a headache, her fury temporarily contained but certainly not extinguished, and Beatrice stood in the centre of the drawing-room, feeling as though the world had tilted on its axis. Agnes found her there some time later, still standing in the same spot, her expression dazed. "Miss Beatrice, you must sit down before you faint. Such excitement! A duke's ball! I can scarcely believe it." "Neither can I, Agnes," Beatrice whispered. "Neither can I." The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity that transformed the previously staid routine of Langley House into something resembling controlled chaos. Madame Rousseau arrived the next morning, a diminutive Frenchwoman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, accompanied by 3 assistants bearing swatches of fabric that seemed to encompass every colour imaginable. "So," Madame Rousseau said, circling Beatrice with an appraising eye that seemed to see past fabric and into the very soul. "You are the young lady who has captured the Duke's interest. I see why. You have the bone structure of a classical statue and the bearing of a queen. We shall make you magnificent." Cordelia hovered throughout the entire fitting, offering suggestions that were really criticisms disguised as helpfulness. "Perhaps something more subdued, madame. Beatrice's colouring is quite delicate and easily overwhelmed by bold hues." Madame Rousseau fixed Cordelia with a look that would have felled a lesser woman. "With respect, Lady Langley, I have been dressing the finest ladies of London for 30 years. I know what will suit Miss Langley, and it is most certainly not subdued. She has been subdued quite enough already, I think." The comment hung in the air, loaded with implication, and Beatrice saw Cordelia's face flush with barely suppressed anger. But even Cordelia dared not openly cross a modiste who dressed duchesses and counted royalty among her clients. In the end, Madame Rousseau created a gown that made Beatrice gasp when she saw the completed creation. It was fashioned of silk the colour of sea foam, a green so pale it was almost silver, with delicate embroidery in silver thread that caught the light with every movement. The neckline was lower than anything Beatrice had ever worn, revealing the graceful line of her neck and the delicate hollows of her collarbones. The skirt fell in elegant lines that suggested rather than revealed the figure beneath, and the overall effect was one of ethereal beauty combined with unmistakable sophistication. "It's perfect," Beatrice breathed, running her fingers over the exquisite fabric. "Of course it is perfect," Madame Rousseau replied, with a satisfied smile. "I do not create imperfection. The Duke will be unable to look at anyone else, which is precisely as it should be." As the day of the ball approached, Cordelia's attempts to undermine the entire endeavour grew more desperate. She suggested that Beatrice was developing a cold and should perhaps rest rather than attend. She claimed that a distant relative had taken ill and might need their immediate attention. She even hinted that there had been some scandal associated with the Duke of Ashworth that made him an unsuitable companion for an innocent young lady. But Lord Edmund, for once in his life, remained firm. He had seen the honour being paid to his daughter, and he would not allow it to be dismissed. Moreover, Damien had taken the precaution of calling at Langley House twice more during the week, ostensibly to ensure that Beatrice had everything she needed for the ball, but really to demonstrate his continued interest and to make it impossible for Cordelia to manufacture an excuse for Beatrice's absence. On these visits, he and Beatrice were permitted to converse in the drawing-room under Cordelia's watchful eye, though the conversations were necessarily restrained by propriety and the presence of an increasingly hostile chaperone. Yet even these brief encounters revealed depths to Damien's character that left Beatrice more certain with each passing day that her feelings for him were deepening beyond simple gratitude. He spoke of his estates with genuine affection for the land and concern for the tenants who worked it. He discussed politics with a nuance that revealed a mind unafraid of complexity and unwilling to accept simple answers to difficult questions. He asked Beatrice's opinions on matters ranging from agricultural reform to educational philosophy, and he listened to her responses with the focused attention of one who truly valued what she had to say. During one such visit, when Cordelia had been momentarily called away to deal with a household matter, Damien leaned closer and spoke in a voice meant only for Beatrice's ears. "Are you being treated well, Miss Langley? I sense that the atmosphere in this house has grown more strained since I extended my invitation. If you are suffering any consequences for accepting it, I would know immediately." Beatrice was touched by his concern, though she was careful to keep her voice light. "My stepmother is displeased, it is true, but she would not dare take any action that might reflect poorly upon the family in your eyes. For the moment, at least, your interest serves as my shield." "Then I shall ensure that my interest remains abundantly clear," Damien replied, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "And, Miss Langley, I want you to know that my invitation was not motivated by pity or by some desire to champion a worthy cause. I invited you because from the moment I saw you in that museum, studying Athena with such passion and intelligence, I could think of nothing and no one else. You have haunted my thoughts every waking moment since, and I very much hope that this ball will be the beginning of something, rather than simply a single magical evening." Beatrice felt her cheeks flush and her heart begin to race. She wanted to respond, to tell him that she felt the same bewildering, exhilarating pull toward him, but Cordelia's footsteps in the hall silenced her. They drew apart just as her stepmother re-entered the room, her sharp eyes immediately noting the heightened colour in Beatrice's cheeks and the satisfied smile on Damien's lips. The night before the ball, Beatrice lay awake once more, but this time her sleeplessness was born of anticipation rather than anxiety. She rose and moved to her window, looking out at the moonlit streets of Mayfair and imagining what the following evening would bring. Would she truly walk into a ballroom filled with London's finest society? Would she dance in Damien's arms while the ton looked on? And what would come after? For she was certain now that Damien's interest was genuine, and equally certain that her own feelings had progressed far beyond gratitude into territory that both thrilled and terrified her. She must have finally dozed, because she woke to Agnes shaking her shoulder gently. "Miss Beatrice, it is time to rise. Today is the day." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Beatrice bathed in water scented with roses, and Agnes washed her hair until it shone like burnished copper. The gown had been delivered the previous evening, and hung now in Beatrice's wardrobe like a promise made manifest. Beatrice touched it reverently, still unable to quite believe that she would actually wear it, that she would actually attend a ball given by the Duke of Ashworth. Cordelia appeared at midday, her expression grave. "Beatrice, I must speak with you privately." Agnes withdrew, and Beatrice steeled herself for whatever final attempt her stepmother would make to poison this evening's joy. "I know you believe I have been unfair to you," Cordelia began, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of something that might have been vulnerability. "I know you think I have kept you confined out of cruelty or some desire to control you. But you must understand, child, that I have only ever sought to protect you." "Protect me from what, stepmother?" Beatrice asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "From life? From happiness? From any possibility of forming connections with other people?" Cordelia's face hardened. "From making the mistakes I made? From believing that passion and romance are more important than security and position? I was once like you, Beatrice, young and foolish and filled with romantic notions. I married for love, and it brought me nothing but heartache. My first husband was charming and handsome and utterly irresponsible. He left me nearly penniless when he died, dependent upon the charity of relatives who made their contempt for me abundantly clear. I swore then that I would never allow any daughter of mine to suffer as I had suffered." Beatrice stared at her stepmother, seeing her for perhaps the first time as something other than simply an oppressor. She saw a woman scarred by disappointment and loss, who had sought to protect her stepdaughter by denying her any opportunity to experience similar pain. It was a twisted sort of love, perhaps, but it was love nonetheless in its own damaged way. "But stepmother," Beatrice said gently, "in protecting me from the possibility of pain, you have guaranteed that I would suffer a different sort of anguish. Loneliness is its own form of heartache, and a life without connection or hope is a kind of living death. Whatever happens tonight or in the future, I would rather risk pain than continue to exist in this grey half-life you have created for me." Cordelia's expression crumpled, and for a moment Beatrice saw tears glinting in her stepmother's eyes. But then the familiar mask reasserted itself, and Cordelia straightened her spine. "You are determined to attend this ball, then? You are determined to pursue this connection with the Duke regardless of the consequences?" "I am," Beatrice replied firmly. "Then I can say no more. But mark my words, Beatrice. Men of the Duke's station do not marry girls like you. They dally and flirt and raise expectations, and then they marry someone of appropriate lineage and leave hearts broken in their wake. Do not say I did not warn you when you find yourself cast aside." The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. For despite Damien's attentions and apparent sincerity, Beatrice could not entirely silence the small voice of doubt that whispered Cordelia might be right. Why would a duke, who could have any woman in England, choose a girl who had been kept from society, whose only accomplishments were books and museums and solitary contemplation? But then she remembered the way Damien had looked at her, the way he had listened to her thoughts and valued her opinions. She remembered his determination to bring her to his ball, despite every obstacle Cordelia had placed in his path. And she chose to have faith, fragile though it might be. As evening approached, Agnes helped Beatrice into the magnificent gown. The silk whispered against her skin like a promise, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she scarcely recognized the woman staring back at her. Agnes had dressed her hair in an elegant arrangement that allowed several curls to frame her face, and the style somehow emphasized the classical beauty of her features. The gown transformed her figure, revealing a grace she had not known she possessed. "Oh, Miss Beatrice," Agnes breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You look like a princess from a fairy story." A delicate knock sounded at the door, and Lord Edmund entered, stopping short at the sight of his daughter. His eyes filled with tears, and he crossed the room to take her hands in his. "My dear child," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you look exactly as your mother did on the night I first saw her at a ball much like the one you will attend tonight. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, and when she agreed to dance with me, I knew my life had been changed forever. I see her in you now, and I am reminded of how much I have failed you both. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become, despite my neglect and Lady Cordelia's restrictions. Can you forgive me, Beatrice?" Beatrice felt tears threaten her own composure, but she squeezed her father's hands and managed a tremulous smile. "There is nothing to forgive, Father. You have always loved me, even if you did not always know the best way to show it. Let us simply be glad for this moment and for whatever the future may bring." The sound of a carriage in the street below drew them to the window. The Ashworth carriage was magnificent, drawn by 4 matched greys and attended by liveried footmen. Beatrice's breath caught at the sight of it, at the reality of what was about to happen. Damien himself emerged from the carriage and strode to the door with purposeful steps. He had promised to collect her personally, to ensure that no last-minute machinations could prevent her attendance. It was a breach of convention, perhaps, but then everything about their acquaintance had existed outside the usual strictures of polite society. When Beatrice descended the stairs to the entrance hall, Damien was waiting, resplendent in formal evening attire that emphasized his commanding presence. But it was his expression when he saw her that made Beatrice's heart soar. His eyes widened, his lips parted slightly, and he stood transfixed as though he had been struck by lightning. "Miss Langley," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are absolutely breathtaking." "Thank you, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, curtsying gracefully. "I am ready if you are willing to take me." "I would be honored beyond measure," Damien said, offering her his arm. "Shall we, my lady?" Beatrice glanced back once to see her father beaming with pride, and Cordelia standing rigid with an expression that mingled resentment and something that might have been grudging acceptance. Then she placed her hand on Damien's arm and allowed him to escort her to the waiting carriage. The interior of the carriage was luxurious, upholstered in velvet the color of midnight, and appointed with every comfort. As soon as they were settled and the carriage began to move, Damien turned to her with an expression of such warmth that Beatrice felt herself blush. "I have been counting the hours until this moment," he said. "The house has been in an uproar of preparation for days, but I confess I cared nothing for any of it, except the prospect of seeing you walk through the doors." "Your Grace, I must thank you," Beatrice began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "Please, when we are alone, will you not call me Damien? And there is no need for thanks. I am the one who should be grateful to you for agreeing to attend, for giving me the opportunity to show you off to all of London, and to perhaps convince you that a duke can be more than simply a title and a grand house." "I have never thought of you as simply a title," Beatrice replied honestly. "From the moment we met, you have been Damien first and the Duke second. But I must confess I am terrified. I have no experience with grand balls or polite society. What if I embarrass you? What if I make some dreadful social error that reflects poorly upon your judgment in inviting me?" Damien reached across the space between them and took her hand, his touch sending warmth flooding through her. "Beatrice, listen to me carefully. You could never embarrass me. Your intelligence, your grace, your genuine warmth and honesty make you worth 1,000 women who have been trained from birth in the superficial arts of society. I do not want you to pretend to be someone you are not. I want you to be exactly yourself, because that is the person who has captivated me so completely." They rode in companionable silence for a time, Beatrice's hand still held in Damien's, the connection between them palpable and electric. As they approached Ashworth House, Beatrice could see lights blazing from every window and hear the strains of music drifting through the evening air. Carriages lined the street, depositing elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen who climbed the steps and disappeared into what looked like a palace. "Are you ready?" Damien asked as their carriage drew to a halt. Beatrice took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Everything in her life was about to change, for better or worse. There would be no going back to the quiet, confined existence she had known. Whatever happened after this night, she would be altered by it. "I am ready," she said, and meant it. Damien emerged first and handed her down from the carriage with exquisite care. As Beatrice's feet touched the ground, she was immediately aware of the eyes upon them. Other guests arriving at the same moment had paused to stare at the sight of the Duke of Ashworth, handing down an unknown young lady with such obvious care and attention. The whispers began immediately, a susurrus of speculation that followed them up the steps. "Who is she? I have never seen her before. She must be someone of importance if the Duke himself collected her. Look at that gown. It must have cost a fortune." Beatrice kept her head high, her hand resting on Damien's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. They passed through doors thrown wide to reveal an entrance hall of breathtaking magnificence. Marble columns soared toward a frescoed ceiling, and twin staircases curved upward to the ballroom above. Flowers adorned every surface, their fragrance perfuming the air, and candlelight blazed from crystal chandeliers that cast rainbows across the assembled guests. As they ascended the staircase, Damien leaned close and murmured, "The entire ton is about to meet the woman who has captured my interest. Let them look their fill and draw whatever conclusions they wish. I am proud to have you on my arm." At the entrance to the ballroom, a major domo announced their arrival. His Grace the Duke of Ashworth and Miss Beatrice Langley. The conversation in the room did not stop, precisely, but it altered in quality. Beatrice felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she and Damien paused at the top of the stairs. The ballroom was even more magnificent than she had imagined, with gilt-trimmed walls, enormous mirrors that multiplied the candlelight and the swirl of elegant dancers, and an orchestra positioned on a dais at the far end. Damien led her onto the floor, just as the orchestra struck up a waltz. Without asking permission, without giving her time to become nervous, he swept her into the dance. His hand at her waist was firm and sure, guiding her through the steps with such expertise that she felt as though she were floating. Beatrice had learned to dance from a manual, practicing alone in her room while imagining distant music, never believing she would actually have the opportunity to dance in a real ballroom with a real partner. But dancing with Damien was nothing like her solitary practice. This was magic made manifest, her body responding to his lead as though they had been dancing together for years rather than moments. They moved in perfect synchrony, and Beatrice found herself laughing with pure joy. "You are a natural dancer," Damien said, smiling down at her. "Though I confess I would have danced with you even if you had trodden on my feet with every step. I find I do not much care what we are doing, as long as I am with you." Around them, the ton watched with undisguised fascination. The Duke of Ashworth, who had danced dutifully but without particular enthusiasm with dozens of young ladies over the past several seasons, was clearly enchanted by this unknown girl. The way he looked at her, the way he held her perhaps a fraction closer than was strictly proper, the way he seemed completely oblivious to everyone else in the room, it all pointed to a gentleman seriously caught. When the waltz ended, Damien did not release her immediately. Instead, he kept her hand in his and led her toward a small group of people standing near one of the tall windows. Beatrice recognized the Earl and Countess of Pemberton, two of the most influential members of society, along with a distinguished-looking elderly gentleman in military dress. "Lord Pemberton, Lady Pemberton, General Fairfax, may I present Miss Beatrice Langley," Damien said with easy confidence. "Miss Langley, I am pleased to introduce you to some of my dearest friends." Lady Pemberton, a handsome woman in her 40s with kind eyes, smiled warmly at Beatrice. "Miss Langley, we are delighted to meet you. Ashworth has spoken of nothing else for the past week, which is quite remarkable considering he is usually the most reticent of men about his personal interests. I fear I have been rather transparent in my admiration," Damien admitted, without embarrassment. "But then Miss Langley inspires a man to honesty." "Tell me, Miss Langley," the Earl asked, his eyes twinkling with good humor, "what is your particular interest? Every young lady seems to have some accomplishment they wish to display. Do you paint? Play? Sing?" "I read, my lord," Beatrice replied honestly. "I have had a great deal of time for reading, and I find that books offer both companionship and education beyond anything else I have encountered." "What sort of books?" General Fairfax inquired, his gruff voice suggesting he expected her to name some lightweight novels or poetry. "Philosophy primarily," Beatrice said, warming to her subject despite the grandeur of her surroundings. "I have been making a study of Platonic thought and its influence on later Christian philosophy. I find the dialogue form particularly fascinating as a method of exploring complex ideas." The general's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "By Jove, a young lady who reads Plato. And what do you make of his theory of forms?" For the next quarter hour, Beatrice found herself engaged in a spirited discussion of classical philosophy with the general, who proved to be remarkably well-read for a military man. Lady Pemberton and the Earl listened with evident amusement, while Damien watched Beatrice with an expression of such open admiration that she felt her cheeks grow warm. "Ashworth, you sly devil," Lord Pemberton said when the philosophical discussion had concluded. You have found yourself a genuine blue stocking, and a beautiful one at that. No wonder you have been so particular all these years. You were waiting for a woman who could match you intellectually as well as aesthetically." "I confess I had given up hope of finding such a woman," Damien replied, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face, "which makes the discovery all the more precious." As the evening progressed, Damien introduced Beatrice to what seemed like half of London's elite. She met countesses and viscounts, baronets and their wives, ladies whose names she had read in the society pages, and gentlemen whose political speeches she had studied. To her surprise, she found herself enjoying most of these encounters. The majority of people she met were intrigued by her intelligence, rather than put off by it, and Damien's obvious approval seemed to lend her a social currency she would never have possessed on her own merits. She danced with the Earl of Pemberton and General Fairfax, with Damien's cousin Lord Marcus Wycliffe, and with several other gentlemen whom Damien personally selected. But it was clear to everyone present that Beatrice's heart belonged to Damien, and that his belonged to her. They kept finding each other across the crowded ballroom, their eyes meeting in silent communication, and whenever propriety permitted, Damien claimed her for another dance. During a country dance that briefly separated them, Beatrice found herself partnering with a young gentleman who introduced himself as Viscount Hartley. "You have caused quite a stir this evening, Miss Langley," he said with a pleasant smile. "The betting books at White's will be full tomorrow with wagers on when Ashworth will make his declaration. The general consensus seems to be that it is a matter of when, not if." Beatrice felt her heart skip at his words. "Sir, I believe you presume too much. His Grace has merely been kind enough to extend his hospitality to me." "My dear Miss Langley," the Viscount replied, his tone gently amused, "I have known Ashworth since we were boys at Eton together. I have never, in all those years, seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. He is not a man given to casual flirtations or meaningless gestures. If he has singled you out in this manner, you may be certain his intentions are entirely serious." Before Beatrice could respond, the dance brought her back to Damien, whose hand clasped hers with a warmth that spoke volumes. When the dance concluded, he led her toward the terrace, where they might find a moment of relative privacy. The night air was cool and sweet, scented with jasmine from the gardens below. Other couples strolled the terrace at discreet distances, but Damien guided Beatrice to a relatively secluded corner where they could speak without being overheard. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked, though the answer must have been plain on her glowing face. "It is beyond anything I ever dreamed," Beatrice replied honestly. "I feel as though I have stepped into one of the novels I have read, except that this is infinitely better because it is real, and you are here." Damien moved closer, his expression growing serious. "Beatrice, I must speak plainly, for I find I am incapable of subtlety where you are concerned. This evening was not simply about giving you the opportunity to attend a ball, though I am glad to have done so. It was about showing all of London that you are under my protection, that I value you above all other women, and that anyone who wishes to know me must accept you as well. But more than that, it was about showing you what your life could be if you would consent to share it with me." Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. "Damien, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I have fallen desperately, irrevocably in love with you," he said, his voice low and intense. "I knew it from the moment I saw you studying that statue of Athena, but I have become more certain with every word we have exchanged, every moment we have spent together. You are everything I never knew I needed, intelligent, compassionate, genuine, and so beautiful it makes my chest ache to look at you. I am saying that I want you to be my Duchess, my wife, my partner in all things. I am saying that I am asking you to marry me." The world seemed to stop spinning. Beatrice stared at Damien, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. He loved her. He wanted to marry her. The Duke of Ashworth, who could have any woman in England, was asking her, Beatrice Langley, the girl who had been locked away from society for 15 years, to be his wife. "But Damien," she whispered, "you barely know me. We have only met a handful of times. How can you be certain of your feelings? How long does it take to recognize the sun when you have been living in darkness?" he replied, reaching up to cup her face gently in his hands. I have spent years being introduced to perfectly suitable young ladies, dancing with them, conversing with them, and feeling nothing but polite interest at best and stultifying boredom at worst. Then I met you, and in the space of a single conversation, you awakened something in me I had begun to believe did not exist. That is not infatuation, Beatrice. That is recognition. My soul recognizing its match in yours. Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks, but they were tears of joy so overwhelming she could scarcely contain it. I love you too, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. I have tried not to, tried to protect myself from hoping for too much, but I cannot help it. You have shown me kindness and respect. You have valued my mind and my heart. You have fought for me when no one else ever has. How could I not love you? Then say yes, Damien urged, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. Say you will marry me, and we will face whatever challenges come together. I know your stepmother will not be pleased, and there may be difficulties ahead, but I promise you, Beatrice, I will never allow anyone to cage you again. As my Duchess, you will have all the freedom you have been denied, all the opportunities to use that remarkable mind of yours, and all the love I have to give. Yes, Beatrice breathed, hardly believing she was saying the word. Yes, Damien, I will marry you. With all my heart, yes. Damien's face transformed with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she laughed and cried simultaneously. Around them, several guests on the terrace had noticed the embrace and were whispering excitedly, but neither Beatrice nor Damien cared. They had found each other against all odds, and the opinion of society paled in comparison to the certainty of their love. Come, Damien said, taking her hand. Let us return inside and I shall make the announcement formally. I want all of London to know that you have agreed to be my wife. They re-entered the ballroom just as the orchestra was concluding a quadrille. Damien signalled to the conductor, who tapped his baton for silence. The chatter of conversation gradually died away as guests realized the Duke was about to make some announcement. Damien stood at the center of the ballroom, Beatrice's hand firmly clasped in his, and addressed the assembled company with the natural authority of one born to lead. My lords and ladies, friends and honored guests, I have an announcement that fills me with the greatest happiness. Miss Beatrice Langley has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. I hope you will join me in celebrating this most joyous occasion. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then Lady Pemberton began to applaud, and the sound was taken up by others until the entire ballroom rang with enthusiastic approval. Gentlemen called out congratulations, ladies rushed forward to exclaim over Beatrice's good fortune, and the orchestra struck up a triumphant melody. In the midst of the celebration, a commotion at the ballroom entrance drew everyone's attention. Beatrice looked up to see her father being admitted by the butler, his face flushed and his expression anxious. Behind him, to Beatrice's shock, was Cordelia, dressed in her customary severe black, and looking as though she had been dragged from her bed. Lord Edmund spotted Beatrice and Damien and pushed through the crowd toward them. Your Grace, Beatrice, I apologize for this intrusion, but when word reached me of your announcement, I felt I must come at once. I could not allow my daughter to become engaged without her father present to give his blessing. Lord Langley, Damien said warmly, still holding Beatrice's hand, your presence honors us. I should have come to you first to ask formally for Miss Langley's hand, but I found myself quite overcome with emotion and unable to wait. No apology necessary, Your Grace, Lord Edmund replied, his eyes shining with tears. I am simply grateful that my daughter has found such happiness. You have my blessing and my profound gratitude for recognizing the treasure that my Beatrice is. Cordelia had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stepped forward, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. She looked at Beatrice, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing not a child to be controlled, but a woman who had escaped her grasp. Beatrice, Cordelia said, her voice tight, I see that you have made your choice. I hope you understand that I only ever wanted to protect you. Beatrice met her stepmother's gaze steadily. I know you believed you were protecting me, stepmother, but in trying to shield me from pain, you nearly stole my chance at joy. I hope that in time, you will be able to be happy for me. Cordelia's face worked with emotion, and for a moment, Beatrice thought she might actually apologize, might acknowledge the damage she had done. But Cordelia was too proud, too fixed in her beliefs for such a transformation. Instead, she simply nodded stiffly and stepped back, defeated but not reconciled. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and celebration. Damien never left Beatrice's side, his pride in her evident to everyone present. She found herself being welcomed into society with an enthusiasm that would have been impossible had she arrived under any other circumstances. The Duke's future Duchess could be nothing less than the Tun's newest favorite, and Beatrice found herself besieged by invitations and expressions of friendship. When the ball finally concluded in the early hours of morning, Damien insisted on escorting Beatrice home personally. They rode through the quiet streets of Mayfair in companionable silence, Beatrice's head resting on Damien's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "I still cannot quite believe this is real," Beatrice said softly. "This morning I was a girl who had never attended a ball. Tonight I am engaged to a duke. It seems impossible." "It is not impossible," Damien replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It is simply the beginning of the life you were always meant to have. Tomorrow we will begin planning the wedding, and I warn you, I am not inclined to wait long. I have spent too many years without you already." When they reached Langley House, Damien helped her down from the carriage and walked her to the door. There, in the soft light of dawn beginning to break over the city, he took both her hands in his. "Thank you for agreeing to be my wife," he said. "Thank you for being brave enough to say yes despite all the reasons you might have said no. I promise you, Beatrice, I will spend every day of our lives together making certain you never regret this decision." "I could never regret choosing love over fear," Beatrice replied. "You have freed me, Damien, not just from my stepmother's restrictions, but from the prison of my own doubts and resignation. You showed me that life could be more than I had imagined, and for that I will be eternally grateful." "We freed each other," Damien said, his eyes intense in the growing light. "For I was as much a prisoner as you were, locked in a life of duty and expectation, with no hope of genuine connection. You showed me what it means to truly live, to feel, to love. We are neither of us imprisoned anymore." He kissed her then properly and thoroughly, and Beatrice felt the last of her fears and doubts melt away. This was real. This was her future, and it was more beautiful than any story she had ever read. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and transformation. True to his word, Damien insisted on a brief engagement, and the wedding was planned for a date only 2 months hence. Beatrice found herself swept up in a tide of activity that would have been overwhelming had Damien not been there to guide her through it. Madame Rousseau was commissioned to create a wedding gown that would outshine even the ball gown she had already created. Lady Pemberton took Beatrice under her wing, introducing her to society and helping her navigate the complex rules of Tun behavior. Invitations poured into Langley House at a rate that left even Cordelia stunned into submission. But the most significant change was in Lord Edmund's behavior toward his wife. The blinders had been removed from his eyes, and he began to see Cordelia's restrictions for what they truly were. He confronted her privately, and though Beatrice was not privy to their conversation, she noticed that her father began to assert himself in household matters for the first time in 15 years. Cordelia, for her part, seemed diminished somehow, her power broken by Beatrice's escape from her control. She moved through the house like a ghost, attending to her duties but without her former authoritarian fervor. Beatrice almost felt sorry for her, understanding now that Cordelia's cruelty had been born of her own pain and fear. One afternoon, about a month before the wedding, Cordelia requested a private audience with Beatrice. They met in the drawing room where so many tense confrontations had occurred, but this time Cordelia's manner was subdued rather than aggressive. "Beatrice, I owe you an apology," Cordelia began, the words clearly costing her dearly. "I have spent these past weeks examining my behavior toward you, and I have been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. I convinced myself that I was protecting you, but in reality I was trying to protect myself from losing another person I had come to care for. If I kept you isolated, you could not leave me. If I prevented you from finding love, you would not discover that love could bring pain as well as joy. I was selfish, and I was cruel, and I am deeply sorry." Beatrice was stunned. She had never expected Cordelia to acknowledge her wrongs, much less apologize for them. "Stepmother, I do not know what to say." "You need say nothing," Cordelia replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do not expect your forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. I simply wanted you to know that I do recognize what I have done, and that I am genuinely happy that you have found someone who values you as you deserve to be valued. The Duke is a good man, and he will make you happy in ways I never allowed you to pursue." Beatrice rose and crossed to where Cordelia sat, doing something she had not done in years. She embraced her stepmother gently. "I do forgive you, Cordelia. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger would poison my own happiness. We cannot change the past, but perhaps we can build a better future." Cordelia returned the embrace stiffly, unused to such displays of affection, but Beatrice felt the older woman trembling with suppressed emotion. It was not a complete reconciliation, perhaps, but it was a beginning, and that was more than Beatrice had dared to hope for. The day before the wedding, Damien took Beatrice to Ashworth House to show her the Duchess's quarters that would soon be hers. The rooms were magnificent, decorated in soft shades of green and cream that Damien had specifically chosen to complement her colouring. But it was the library that made Beatrice gasp with delight. An entire wing of the house had been converted into a private library for her use, with towering shelves filled with books on every subject imaginable. There were comfortable chairs positioned near tall windows, writing desks equipped with the finest paper and ink, and a collection of classical sculptures that reminded her poignantly of the day they had met. "I had them bring Athena," Damien said, gesturing to a replica of the statue from the British Museum positioned in a place of honour. "I thought you might like to be reminded of where our story began." Beatrice turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect." "You are perfect. How did I become so fortunate?" "I am the fortunate one," Damien replied, pulling her into his arms. "Tomorrow you will become my Duchess, and every day after that I will wake up grateful that you said yes to a stranger in a museum who was bold enough to believe in love at first sight." The wedding took place at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, with what seemed like half of London in attendance. Beatrice wore a gown of ivory silk embroidered with silver thread, her mother's pearls at her throat, and a veil of the finest lace that had been worn by Damien's mother at her own wedding. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on Damien's face, seeing there the love and commitment that would sustain them through whatever challenges life might bring. Lord Edmund gave her away with tears streaming down his face, whispering, "Your mother would be so proud. I am so proud." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and solemn vows. Damien's voice was strong and sure as he promised to love, honour and cherish her. Beatrice's voice trembled with emotion but never wavered as she made her own vows. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Damien kissed her with a passion barely contained by the sacred setting, Beatrice felt as though her heart might burst with joy. The wedding breakfast was held at Ashworth House, a magnificent affair attended by everyone who mattered in London society. Beatrice sat beside her new husband at the head table, accepting congratulations and well wishes with a grace that belied her inexperience with such gatherings. Lady Pemberton had become a dear friend, and she raised a toast to the new Duchess that brought tears to many eyes. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying across the assembly, "may their love be as enduring as it is inspiring. They have shown us all that true happiness comes not from conforming to society's expectations, but from having the courage to follow one's heart and to recognize love when it appears, even in the most unexpected places." As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Damien led Beatrice away from the festivities to a small balcony overlooking the gardens. The summer sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and in the distance they could hear the sounds of London settling into evening. "Are you happy, my love?" Damien asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," Beatrice replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "A few months ago, I was a girl locked away from life, resigned to a future of loneliness and restriction. Now I am a duchess, married to the man I love with all the freedom and opportunity I could ever desire. It seems like something from a dream. Then we shall spend the rest of our lives ensuring it remains a beautiful dream, Damien said, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. We shall travel if you wish. We shall fill your library with more books than you could read in a lifetime. We shall host gatherings of the finest minds in England, so you can engage in all the philosophical debates your heart desires. We shall do whatever makes you happy, because your happiness is now the primary purpose of my existence. And what makes you happy? Beatrice asked, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. This, Damien replied simply. You in my arms, my ring on your finger, my name now yours. Knowing that every morning I will wake beside you, and every evening I will fall asleep with you in my embrace. Knowing that you chose me as I chose you, not for my title or my wealth, but for the man I am beneath all the trappings of rank. That is all the happiness I require. They kissed as the sun set over London, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had fought past obstacles and restrictions to claim the love they deserved. And in that moment, as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, they both knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The first page of a story that would be written together, in joy and love, and the perfect freedom of two hearts finally united. In the years that followed, Beatrice became known throughout England, not just as the Duchess of Ashworth, but as a patron of education and a champion of women's intellectual development. She established schools for girls where classical education was emphasized alongside traditional accomplishments. She hosted salons at Ashworth House, where ladies could gather to discuss philosophy, science, and literature without fear of being dismissed as unfeminine or unsuitable. Damien supported her every endeavor, proud beyond measure of his brilliant, compassionate wife. Together they raised 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, whom they encouraged to pursue knowledge and to value intelligence alongside kindness. The Ashworth children were taught that true nobility came not from birth, but from character, and that love was the greatest achievement any person could claim. Lord Edmund spent his remaining years as a doting grandfather, finally understanding the importance of being present in the lives of those he loved. And even Cordelia, humbled by her mistakes, became a gentler version of herself in her later years, finding some measure of peace in accepting rather than controlling the world around her. But it was Beatrice and Damien who remained the heart of the story, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. On their 25th wedding anniversary, they returned to the British Museum, standing once more before the statue of Athena, where their story had begun. Do you remember what you said to me that day? Damien asked, his hair now touched with grey, but his eyes still as warm and loving as they had been in their youth. I said that Athena represented everything I admired. Wisdom, courage, and independence, Beatrice replied, still as beautiful as the day he had first seen her, though life had added character to her loveliness. You became all of those things, Damien said softly. Not because I freed you from your stepmother's control, but because you had the courage to seize the life you deserved when the opportunity presented itself. You saved yourself, my love. I simply had the privilege of standing beside you while you did so. Beatrice smiled and leaned against him, their bodies fitting together as perfectly as they had on their first waltz. We saved each other, she corrected, and we continue to save each other every day, from loneliness and complacency and the belief that life must be endured rather than celebrated. That is what love does. It transforms the impossible into the inevitable and makes every day an adventure worth experiencing. They stood together in the quiet of the museum, surrounded by the artifacts of civilizations long vanished, and knew that their own story would endure not in stone or metal, but in the hearts of their children and the countless lives they had touched. They had proven that love could conquer even the most rigid restrictions, that courage could overcome the deepest fears, and that happiness was not just a possibility, but a right worth fighting for. And in the end, that was all any story need be. A testament to the power of love, the triumph of hope, and the beautiful impossible possibility that 2 souls might find each other against all odds and build a life together that exceeded even their most cherished dreams. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.